I met Lucas during a time when I was desperate for something, anything, that felt like a fresh start. Back then, I was living in a small town, working odd jobs to make ends meet, and dreaming of a life that felt bigger than the one I had. Lucas came into my life through a dating site, his messages warm and thoughtful, filled with just the right amount of charm to make me believe in something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. We talked for hours, sharing everything from our favorite childhood memories to dreams about where we saw ourselves in the future. He promised me a life of love and stability if I moved to Texas to be with him, and I believed him. It all sounded so perfect. The day I packed up my car and left my home behind was bittersweet. I was scared to leave, but Lucas's words gave me courage. He had told me I'd be staying in his grandmother's old house, empty and waiting for us to build a future together. The idea of having our own space, a place we could call home, made the leap of faith feel worth it. When I arrived in Texas, though, the reality was nothing like what I had imagined. The house wasn't cleared out as Lucas had promised. It was cluttered with old furniture and dusty boxes, as if no one had touched it in years. He waved it off, saying he just needed more time to get it ready. I tried to believe him, but the cracks in his promises were already showing. It didn't take long for things to get more complicated. Since the house wasn't livable, Lucas insisted I stay with his parents. They were polite at first, welcoming me as a guest, but there was an unspoken expectation that I would earn my keep. I started helping with cooking and cleaning to avoid feeling like a burden. His parents were deeply religious, and while they never outright said anything, their judgment weighed heavily on me. I couldn't tell if it was because I wasn't married to Lucas or because I didn't quite fit into their world. Either way, the warmth they showed me in the beginning quickly cooled. Lucas, meanwhile, seemed increasingly distant. He was rarely home, leaving me alone with his parents more often than not. I spent my days trying to convince myself that this was just a phase, that he'd show me the affection he had in our early days. When I asked him about the house again, he brushed me off with vague excuses. I started to wonder if he'd ever planned for me to live there at all. But I was in too deep to turn back. I had left everything behind for him, and the thought of admitting to my family that I'd made a mistake was too humiliating to bear. When Lucas got me a job at the clothing retailer where he worked, I thought it might be my chance to regain some independence. At first, it was a relief to have somewhere to go every day, a place where I wasn't just the girl who moved in with Lucas. But the relief didn't last long. The store had its own social dynamics, and it wasn't long before I started hearing whispers about Lucas. He seemed overly friendly with one of our co-workers, Mara, a woman with a magnetic personality who could charm anyone in the room. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that I was just being paranoid. After all, he had brought me here. That had to mean something, didn't it? Mara's presence soon became impossible to ignore. She and Lucas were always laughing together, sharing inside jokes that I wasn't a part of. One day, I overheard her calling me the stray. It stung more than I cared to admit, but Lucas didn't seem to notice. Or worse, he didn't care. I buried my frustration, telling myself that things would get better. But deep down, I knew the foundation of our relationship was already beginning to crumble. The leap of faith I had taken now felt more like a free fall, with no way to stop the descent. Things with Lucas started shifting in ways that were hard to ignore. At first, I told myself I was imagining it, that I was just overthinking the little things. But the signs became clearer with each passing day. Lucas, the man who once spent hours talking to me about our future, now seemed to avoid me like I was a burden. He stopped holding my hand in public and brushed off any attempts I made to talk about our relationship. At work, he acted as if I barely existed, his friendliness reserved for Mara and a few others who seemed to hang on his every word. The worst part was that he wouldn't even acknowledge me as his girlfriend in front of our co-workers. When someone asked about me, he'd shrug it off or say something vague like, "It's complicated." Hearing those words stung more than I wanted to admit. I began to wonder if bringing me to Texas had been about love at all, or if I had simply been convenient, a role to fill until he found something or someone else. One day at work, one of the other girls, a quiet, observant type who rarely spoke up, approached me while we were both folding clothes in the stockroom. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant, as she told me she thought I should be careful with Lucas. She hinted that he had a history of manipulating people, especially women, and that I wasn't the first person he had made grand promises to. I wanted to dismiss her words as gossip, but there was something in the way she spoke, as if she knew more than she was saying. The seed of doubt she planted grew quickly. Meanwhile, Mara's influence in Lucas's life became impossible to ignore. She was beautiful and confident, the kind of person who made everything look effortless. She had a knack for pulling people into her orbit, and Lucas was no exception. They'd laugh together at inside jokes and share lingering looks that made my stomach churn. Rumors about the two of them started making their way back to me, but every time I tried to confront Lucas, he'd brush me off, saying I was being jealous or paranoid. Still, the way he looked at her, like she was the sun, was something he hadn't done with me in a long time. As if that wasn't enough, Lucas's frustration with his job started spilling over into our lives. He had been gunning for a promotion for months, convinced it was his turn to move up the ladder. But when someone else got the position, his mood shifted overnight. He started coming home late, slamming doors, and muttering about how they'd regret underestimating him. His bitterness filled the air like smoke, choking out what little peace was left between us. At work, he became short-tempered with customers and co-workers alike, though Mara always seemed to escape his ire. The tension in my life was unbearable. Lucas's unpredictable moods, Mara's meddling, and the whispers of betrayal swirling around the store left me feeling cornered. I had given up so much to be with him, my home, my independence, my sense of self, and now I didn't know who I was anymore. I tried to hold on, convincing myself that things would get better, that the man I had fallen in love with was still in there somewhere. But deep down, I knew the truth. Lucas wasn't the man I thought he was, and I wasn't sure if I had the strength to walk away. For now, I stayed, caught between the memories of what we once had and the grim reality of what we'd become. The night everything came crashing down started like any other, quiet, tense, and full of unspoken frustrations. Lucas had been distant all evening, barely looking at me during dinner at his parents' house. By then, we were more like strangers sharing a roof than partners. I had learned to tiptoe around his moods, but something about that night felt different. He wasn't just angry. He was simmering with a kind of restrained energy that made my skin crawl. When he told me to get in the car, I hesitated. There was something in his tone that wasn't a request, but a command, one I didn't feel safe disobeying. I asked him where we were going, but he only said, "You'll see." His grip on the steering wheel was white-knuckled, his jaw set in a hard line. The roads grew darker as we drove farther away from town, the faint glow of streetlights giving way to endless stretches of backcountry. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared out the window, trying to map our route in case I needed to find my way back. After what felt like hours, Lucas finally pulled the car onto a narrow dirt road surrounded by trees. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of the engine cutting off. He turned to me, his face shadowed in the dim light, and said, "You think you can leave me?" His voice was low, almost calm, but there was a sharpness to it that made my breath catch. I didn't know how to respond. My mind raced, trying to piece together what he meant. Before I could speak, he pulled something from under the seat, a gun. The sight of it froze me in place. My hands clenched the fabric of my jeans as panic washed over me. Lucas spun the cylinder, the sound sharp and deliberate, before pointing the gun at me. "You said you loved me," he said, his eyes burning with something I couldn't name. "Prove it." I couldn't believe what was happening. It was like I had been thrust into a nightmare, one I couldn't wake up from. He tilted his head, almost amused by my silence, and added, "It's just a game." He explained the rules of his twisted game: a single bullet, a spin of the cylinder, and a pull of the trigger. My stomach churned as I realized he wasn't bluffing. He pressed the cold metal to my temple, his finger hovering over the trigger, and demanded I beg for my life. I could barely breathe, let alone speak, but I managed to stammer out words I didn't even remember. Every second felt like an eternity, the empty clicks of the gun reverberating in my ears like a death knell. In a moment of sheer desperation, I saw my chance. Lucas had set the gun down briefly, distracted by his own ranting, and I seized the opportunity to grab my phone. I fumbled with it, my hands shaking, and sent a single text to the only person I could think of, my friend from back home. "Help, Lucas, remote, call police," I managed to type before he noticed. He lunged for the phone, but I had already hit send. Adrenaline surged through me as I bolted out of the car and into the trees. The darkness was disorienting, but I ran as fast as I could, branches tearing at my clothes and skin. Lucas was behind me, shouting my name, his voice filled with rage. I didn't stop until I saw headlights cutting through the distance. My friend had called the police, and they arrived just in time to scare Lucas off. But he didn't go far, and when I told the officers what had happened, their response was infuriatingly passive. "No evidence," they said. "He's gone for now. Just stay safe." The system that was supposed to protect me had failed, and I was left to pick up the pieces on my own. The hours after my escape felt like a blur. I sat in the back of a police car, shaking so hard I could barely hold the cup of water they handed me. My friend stood nearby, her face pale with worry, but the officer's calm, detached demeanor only made the situation feel more surreal. They asked questions, lots of them, but when it came to action, they offered little more than a shrug. "Without evidence," one of them said, "there's not much we can do." Those words left me hollow. I had expected safety, justice, something, but all I got was the chilling realization that Lucas was still out there, free to do whatever he wanted. That night, my friend took me to her apartment. She didn't ask for details, just handed me a blanket and let me curl up on her couch. I didn't sleep. Every noise outside made my heart race. Every shadow felt like Lucas lurking nearby. By morning, I knew I couldn't stay in Texas. It was too dangerous, and I couldn't trust the people around me. Not Lucas's family, not the police, not even the co-workers who had heard the rumors and said nothing. I packed a small bag and left, cutting ties with everyone who might lead him back to me. In the weeks that followed, I moved into hiding. I stayed with a series of friends, always looking over my shoulder, always waiting for the moment Lucas might show up. The fear became a constant companion, one I carried with me everywhere. I deleted my social media accounts, changed my phone number, and avoided using my real name whenever possible. Even grocery shopping felt like a risk, as if he could appear in the cereal aisle at any moment. The paranoia was suffocating, but it was the only way I knew to survive. Therapy became my lifeline. It took months to find a counselor I trusted, but when I did, it felt like a small ray of light breaking through the darkness. Talking about the trauma was excruciating at first, reliving every detail, every moment of fear, but it was also a way to take back control. My therapist helped me see that the shame I carried wasn't mine to bear. Lucas's actions weren't my fault, no matter how much I had blamed myself for falling into his trap. Slowly, I started to untangle the web of guilt and fear he had woven around me. As I began to heal, I started finding pieces of myself I thought I'd lost forever. I found a job in a neighboring town, far from the place where everything had fallen apart. The work wasn't glamorous, but it gave me a sense of independence I hadn't felt in years. I reconnected with old friends who reminded me of the person I was before Lucas, a person who loved to laugh, who believed in her own strength. Their support was a lifeline, pulling me back to a place where I could breathe again. The scars Lucas left behind didn't disappear, but they became part of my story, a story I decided to share. Writing about what happened became a form of therapy, a way to process the pain and turn it into something meaningful. I wrote about the danger of blind trust, about the signs I had missed, and about the system that failed to protect me. My hope was that by telling my story, I could help others recognize the red flags I had ignored. It wasn't justice, but it was something. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was reclaiming my life, one word at a time.